Welcome back from your coffee break, and we're now going to have 3 presentations, each of half an hour. So we'll move our timing forwards by 10 minutes as the day unfolds. The next 3 presentations are all for half an hour. So Martinez, please will you invite Kira to join me so that I can introduce her for the next presentation. Oh, good morning, Kira. Very good to see you. Good afternoon now in Ukraine. And thank you very much for speaking to us today and sharing the fruits of your research work. We're really pleased to have you with us. I'll just introduce you and then you can begin your presentation. So Kira is the head of Department of Psychology at the National Pedagogical University, and she's a member of the Ukrainian Register of Psychotherapists. And she's been part of a really important piece of work, and she'll present to us about the latest studies related to the mental health and resources of Ukrainian psychotherapists at the forefront of social and mental changes. And she will talk about the psychotherapists who have remained in Ukraine. We look forward to what you have to say to us, Kira. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me well? Yes, thank you. So, I hope that Martinez will show my presentation. While we still do not have the presentation, I would like to start that actually we all together with the team of our psychotherapists, I will still be talking about them today. We decided that despite such a situation in which we all are right now, it is very important to understand what's going on with our families, what's going on with us as with psychotherapists, and how can we actualize our personal resources and how we when we live in this condition of war and work with our patients in such state of war. We also have such research that is dedicated to changes of group conscious. Yes, so maybe I will not have time for this last part, but I will just announce it for future. During from the beginning of the war, systemic psychotherapists, and I do belong to them, were researching what was going on in families and what changes were there in us as therapists in relations with our clients. Partially, additionally, Olena Dobrodnyak will talk about this today. She is our colleague, and I will show you some tendencies right now that we have found during the last 1.5 years in the beginning of the war. It's research of mine and Larissa Hushchina, our colleague, also as a systematic family therapist. And when we work with families, when we started working with families, we found out that there are much more divorces right now to compare with pre-war time. But Ministry of Justice also mentions that there are lots of actually marriages for this for half year of this war. Ukrainians married much more often than for the same period 1 year again. So we have found almost 44% of Ukrainians who had to move from their families because of the war. And it provokes and it can lead to the fact that first of all, from the beginning of the war, we have such families where husbands fight, where they are on the front lines, and their wives and children are either in Ukraine or abroad, and the wives of such military men, of such soldiers, they are worried because when they text to their husbands, they usually answer something like 450, and it is this military slang. It means that everything's okay, everything's calm, nothing's to worry about. And emotional, there is usually a problem that they feel they feel that their works become very, very short, because when wives start asking, what's going on, there, how are you feeling, then men very often answer that I cannot tell you about that, and I cannot tell you about this, and wives have this increased level of anxiety and increased level of worrying. So this, if we talk about families of militaries, of soldiers. But when we are talking about civilian families, then in those cases, when wives and children moved abroad, they kind of have different problems, because husbands stay in Ukraine and wives have to adapt to a new country, to new life. They are looking for the opportunity to survive. Lots of challenges appear, what to do with their children, I mean, learning, routine, and husbands at the same time live in a completely different world. And it turns out that men have their own problems, those who stay in Ukraine, but they are not on the front line. And men can lose their jobs at the same time. They can lose the opportunity to provide for their families financially. And of course, it frustrates them. So that's why after some period of time, their works stop overlapping. And wives with children, that is one world, and men, husbands who stay in Ukraine, that's a different world. Maybe this is the reason why we fixed this increase of the amount of divorces currently. What factors can we mention that can become the reasons for divorces during this period of time? Apart from the fact that, as we have mentioned, lots of families had to separate, we don't need to forget that before the beginning of the war, we had COVID-19 epidemics and certain measures connected with that were on for a pretty long period of time. And in such situation, already lots of families then faced with the fact that somehow they need to build their relations while staying at home all the time, when children and husbands and wives were staying at home for a long period of time. It led to the fact that more problems appeared in many families, and there is certain growth of some level of pressure and intensity. So we can say that one of the factors that influenced the divorce rate was actually that factor that war gave this permission to divorce, because the need to go abroad and to leave the husband first physically leads to the fact that part of some women, they start thinking that emotionally they were not very close with their husbands as they really wanted it to be. And apart from the fact that there are some families where the problems accumulated and war only exacerbated such problems or kind of pushed them to certain solution through the way of divorce and not to put up with something or look for some opportunities to solve such problems. And a part of the fact, those families which had really good, warm relations, but while separating, it looks like they do not have enough resource. Why presentation is not moving? I'm sorry, because people mentioned that I think you need to mention. Okay. Okay, so yes, so then one more slide, please. The next slide. Yes, thank you. So, apart from what I have already mentioned, yes, those reasons, there can be different reactions of that married couple to the stress that took place. For example, somebody can react, for instance, by having anxiety, somebody might have depression, somebody might try to somehow isolate themselves from existing problems. And then if it happens, if married couple have different reactions, then they have this feeling of not understanding of each other. And instead of uniting in overcoming this general problem, once again, they feel certain emotional distance. Also, it is important to say that for many people, priorities have changed. When the war started, their priorities changed, and that's why those priorities also might not coincide in married couple. And one of the main factors, this is a so-called lack of resources for feelings, because we have lots of anxiety, we have necessity to solve certain urgent routine problems, routine tasks. So that's why those feelings, they kind of in the background, and married couple without understanding that it not only the problem for now, but for the future, stops paying enough attention to providing support to each other, to telling each other that I love you, to sharing not only your worries, but also your some hopes and good news. Please, next slide. So I do not have that much time left, but we will also have speeches of my colleagues Vladimir Pogorely and Olena Dobrodnyak. So I will finish here about families, my part of speech. My colleagues will tell about that additionally. The second part that I wanted to draw attention to is that this idea was already in our society for some period of time. We discussed this during the Secretariat meeting, that it would be nice to understand what's going on with us as psychotherapists, like with people. And in September, we, together with Vladimir Pogorely, with the help of the Secretariat of Ukrainian Association of Psychotherapists, made the survey where around 100 respondents took place, and around 25% were men, 75% women. 57% of respondents are in Ukraine. They did not moved to some other regions, and they also did not go abroad. So me and Volodya, we shared the results of this research into two parts. So I will talk more about those therapists who stayed in Ukraine, and Volodya will be talking about those therapists who had to move abroad. Please, the next slide. Please have one more slide. Yes, thank you. So you can see you saw the diagram where you saw what problems were in therapists when the war started. What did they feel? So the idea of our research was to look at what challenges we were facing with, and the second vector of this was to understand how did we manage to overcome those challenges and how did we manage to do that. So based on the result of our research, we have found out that in the first months of war, our respondents had 74% of them had dietary disorders, and among them, 37% had problems with overeating, 35% started eating less, and 28% of surveyed changed their tastes and eating habits. Also, 89% of our survey, we observed some problems with sleeping disorders. So you can see that some of them had problems with falling asleep, some of them were waking up too early, some had problems with both falling asleep and waking up. 70% did not have enough sleep, and 7% were sleeping practically the whole day. And when we conducted, when we were trying to divide it into separate groups, men and women, then we saw that at the beginning of war reflected more on women well-being, and big part of women still have some problems with their feelings, and it is partially still there. Please, the next slide. When we were thinking about overcoming difficulties and stress that appeared, then we had this idea to look at values that are important for our psychotherapists. So 33% mentioned the meaning of professional values, 32% family values, 22% mentioned natural optimism, 12% religion values, and 1% civic position. It is how our respondents defined their values and their influence on increasing on their internal resources. Please, the next slide. One more, please. So you have seen this general picture, the diagram, how psychotherapists stabilize themselves and how they adapted to new conditions of life. This picture is pretty versatile because we can, if we are talking about majority, then for most people, ways of stabilization were more often communication with relatives and closed ones. They were trying to build their routine in a better way. They were trying to pay attention to their favorite things. They limited communication with so-called toxic people, and they were doing with volunteering, and they limited consumption of information. So when we were looking at how men dealing with that and how women dealing with that, the situation is more or less the same. Values in male and female answers are also almost equally shared and divided. When we discussed, by the way, yes, despite of the fact that we conducted surveys, we also had several focus groups where we discussed certain issues that were not included in those surveys or which we wanted to have a little bit deeper understanding about. So when we were discussing with my colleagues how they continue working as psychotherapists, then we found out that part of therapists changed the conditions of their settings. Part of them reoriented their clients for different groups. Some of them changed prices, their tariffs for psychotherapy. We can say that practically all respondents provided during this time, apart from free therapeutical services, also free psychotherapeutical support or help, or for some socially acceptable price. But the only thing, the difference between men and women here was that 10% more among men, they limited their professional load than women. So men probably felt that they were more tired in their professional activity. A very important factor was that factor of having peer support. So the thing is that from the beginning of the military hostile actions, almost all sections of and directions of Ukrainian Association of Psychotherapy once per week started conducting groups of peer support, and such in majority of such groups this still function. 58% of the survey to take active part in such groups of peer support. This is what is about factors of stabilization and adaptation. The next slide, please. Also, we tried somehow to touch the topic of influencing previous personal and transgenerational traumas on reactions of our respondents. 64% of the surveyed mentioned that they had their own experience of traumatic events even before the war. When we asked about influence or impact and peculiarities of a story of generations of our therapists, then we found out that 54% of psychotherapists considers then history of their generation helped them to overcome stress, and 8% think that history of their generation exacerbated the stress that they received during the outbreak of the war. The numbers are 17% higher. We are talking about traumatic events in male than in females, and males have tendency to think that story of their generation helped them to overcome stress. There is only 5% difference. Actually, it is not that significantly important. So this is how we defined those factors that we have mentioned, and that's how they influence those respondents who stayed in Ukraine. When we were trying to clear out about some somatic diseases or increased anxiety because it was all going on with the majority of therapists, some dietary disorders and sleep disorders, our therapists also were going through fear, panic, loss of control. They also felt anxiety, aggression, tiredness, and partially it led to some tense situation in family, at work, and with neighbors. For the first stage, from the beginning of the war, for stabilizing themselves, those respondents who felt lots of different discomfort for some period of time were taking some medicine or psychoactive psychoactive medicine. So the part of them also had to address for medical to apply for medical help. On the other hand, those people who had some formed religious values started, or maybe more often, or for somebody first in their life, visiting some religious communities, and they turned to meditations and praises. They started to pray more. So when we had this comparative analysis between parts of psychotherapists who left the country and those who stayed, then we have found out that respondents who stayed in Ukraine were more stress resilient, and they managed to not have such negative influence and to adapt more to the conditions of the martial law. The next slide, please. I just forgot to tell you about that. Yes, one more, please. So 67% of respondents who stayed in Ukraine considers then influence of of their story of their family helped them to survive stress, and it's 31% higher in those respondents who moved. I think that we have possibilities to study that influence of transgenerational trauma on that on those generations which now living in Ukraine or left Ukraine. But the previous hypothesis statement can also be connected with the fact how in our own individual therapy or in group therapy we discussed and worked on certain traumas which were received in families, in generations, certain generations of our psychotherapists, because you are talking about it with them during the communication in certain groups. So it is this hypothesis that if they manage to process their transgenerational trauma or their own trauma, it can exacerbate resources, strengthen resources that help living through stress. Please tell me how much time do I still have left? Who can tell me that? I practically do not have time anymore.
Just 2 minutes or so, Kira, if that's okay. Okay.
Okay, it's not really okay, but nothing's to be done. So the next slide, please. I will just announce then that colleagues Alexander Fields, me, Kira Sedykh, and Natalia Toraitska, we have had for several years already, starting from 2015, we in Truskavec, we have there the project in Truskavec, and we conduct research with big group, which is in this involved in this Truskavec project, and the results of the analysis results and the analysis of such processes that are in this big group let us tell about very distinguished parallelism between general social cultural processes in Ukraine and dynamic processes in big groups. The next slide, please. We rely on the theory of systems and systematic psychotherapy and analytical psychotherapy, and we can say that actually this psychoanalytic group, as well as society in general, it was our idea during the analysis to view it from the analytical point of view, and it can have paranoid schizoid position, depressive position of pairing, and those terms which are used in British psychoanalysis and were used by Bion. And since why our research started in 2015, because even then Ukraine already suffered some invasion. The Crimea was annexed. There were fights for Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine, and for us it was extremely important to find that tool, psychotherapeutic, the tool of psychotherapeutic research through which we were able to try to understand what was going on in societal conscious or unconscious. But I understand that I have limited time, but I would like to say that in 2019, Ukrainian society moved in several years from 2015 from paranoid schizoid position to depressive one, and it was at that specific time that we had elections of Zelensky conducted, and actually, in our opinion, it kind of correlates with what means this depressive position, where we have hope for some kind of messiah. And when the full-fledged invasion started, large-scale invasion in 2022, we have noticed that society once again was in this paranoid schizoid position, and it was reflected in the fact that there were many, that it was this huge distinction between the fact that we know who's our enemy and that everybody else, those who are here in Ukraine, they are all like us, and all the others, they are they. And we again had this understanding of world as black and white. During the last session in our Truskavec project that took place in August this year, 2023, we could have noticed that this position changed in such a way that society became more versatile, not so homogeneous. So once again, we have certain formed separate stratas of society, layers of society. Once again, we have some niche for different categories of people, and some is fighting, some is helping, and somebody just supports stability for well-being of the country. So we continue this research, and we hope that in the nearest future we'll be able to provide more details and to provide more in-depth analysis of this research in Ukrainian society and international society as well. Thank you, dear colleagues, for your attention. I think that we will be able to continue our talk also during small group discussion and roundtable discussion. Patricia, thanks a lot for your for the fact that your energy and your kindness, your attention, we managed to conduct such meetings, and thanks to all the other colleagues and Martinas and all our other foreign colleagues for the fact that we now have this very important for us opportunity to communicate with colleagues and to to tell them about our research and worries. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so very much, Kira. Thank you for your comments to us all, and thank you for your presentation and how excellent it is that you have been able to take the time to gather research and the time to think, even in the midst of war. This is exceptional to be able to do this in the midst of the time of war. And so it's an excellent work, which I'm sure is ongoing, and how very interesting the findings that you already have are. Thank you so much. There will be more time, particularly in the round table, for you to say more, particularly about the depressive position and all of that you referenced. Beyond that, would be excellent to hear more about that, perhaps in the round table. Okay.